They got to the story before you got to the room. They whispered first, framed you fast, and counted on your panic to finish the job for them. But lies are heavy, and truth has endurance. By the end of this message, you will understand how gossip tries to isolate you, why desperate self-defense often backfires, and how to stand still long enough for truth to outlast the noise. If you feel protected in this season, type 777 below, like this video, and subscribe to this channel. One of the most disorienting kinds of pain is not being attacked to your face. It is realizing something is moving behind your back. A change in tone, a colder room, a conversation that stops when you enter, a person who suddenly seems distant without explanation, a strange look, an awkward silence. The feeling that people are responding to a version of you that you never actually presented to them yourself. That kind of experience can shake a person deeply because it touches more than reputation. It touches belonging. It touches safety. It touches the ancient human fear of being cut off from the group without fully understanding why. That is why gossip hurts the way it does. It is not just words floating around in the air. It is social positioning. It is atmosphere shaping. It is narrative building. It is one person trying to place you inside other people's minds before you have a chance to stand there as yourself. And once you understand that, the mechanics of gossip become much easier to recognize. Gossip is rarely only about information. It is about influence. The person spreading it is not just saying something. They are planting emotional direction. They are telling people how to feel about you before those people have enough first-hand experience to decide for themselves. They are trying to tilt the room. Maybe they present themselves as concerned. Maybe they sound wounded. Maybe they say they hate drama while carrying it from person to person. Maybe they do not even make direct accusations at first. They just imply, suggest, hint, raise questions, use tone, use timing, use carefully chosen omissions, use phrases like, I probably shouldn't say this, but, or I just think people should be careful, or I'm not trying to turn anyone against them, I just want you to know what happened. That kind of language is strategic, because gossip often survives, not through outright proof, but through emotional suggestion. Once the suggestion lands, people begin filling in the blanks themselves. And when people fill in blanks emotionally, they often become more convinced than if they had heard a clear lie in the first place. That is why smear energy can spread so quickly. It uses partial truth, selective framing, and emotional timing to create suspicion. And suspicion is powerful because it changes the lens before the evidence even arrives. Now everything you do gets read through that lens. Your silence looks guilty. Your confidence looks arrogant. Your distance looks suspicious. Your pain looks manipulative. Your attempts to clarify look defensive. Even your calm can get reinterpreted as coldness. That is how isolation begins. Not always through one dramatic public accusation, often through quiet contamination. A few people hear something, then they shift. Then others feel the shift without knowing the full source. Then the atmosphere changes. Then you start noticing that you are not only dealing with one person's words, you are dealing with the social ripple of those words, moving through people who do not even know they are participating in the distortion. That is why smear campaigns feel so invasive. They enter rooms before you do. They sit in conversations you were never invited into. They alter other people's posture toward you while you are still trying to understand why everything feels slightly off. And for a person with a tender heart, this can be spiritually exhausting. Because your instinct may be to believe that if people just knew the truth, everything would settle. If you could just explain it. If you could just correct the falsehood. If you could just tell your side clearly enough, the fog would lift and everybody would see what really happened. That instinct is understandable. But before we get there, we need to stay with the mechanics a little longer. Because gossip does not only spread by speech, it spreads by emotional leverage. The person smearing you often understands something very well. People are more likely to believe a story when it flatters their existing bias, feeds their curiosity, or makes them feel morally important. That is why gossip often travels through people who enjoy feeling in the know. It gives them a sense of special access. It lets them feel close to drama without admitting that they are feeding it. It lets them participate in judgment while telling themselves they are simply being informed. That is a dangerous combination, especially when the person spreading the story got to the microphone first. First stories carry power. The first version people hear often becomes the frame through which later information gets interpreted. Even if the truth comes later, it has to fight to an atmosphere that was already shaped before it arrived. That is why many people feel such intense panic when they realize gossip is spreading. They know they are not just dealing with words. They are dealing with the head start of a false frame, and if the one spreading the smear is skilled, they will often build that frame carefully. They may present themselves as the wounded party. They may exaggerate their own pain and reduce yours to make the story cleaner. They may remove context that would make their behavior look less innocent. They may choose details that make them sound restrained and you sound unstable. They may retell a conflict as though they were only trying to help, only trying to be kind, only trying to be kind, only trying to protect others. That is how a smear often works. It does not need total fiction. It only needs distorted selection. And distorted selection can be very convincing to people who are not there. This is also why gossip so often creates isolation before it creates open confrontation. People may not come to you directly. They may simply pull back, stop including you, start watching you differently, become less warm, less trusting, less spontaneous. Something in the field around you changes, and you can feel it even when nobody is naming it. That is a painful kind of loneliness, not just because others feel distant, but because you are being distanced through a version of events you did not consent to. And when that happens, many sensitive people start doing something that makes the whole thing worse. They panic. Of course they do. Anybody would feel the pull. You hear there is gossip. You sense people turning. You realize your name is moving through mouths that do not carry your heart. And suddenly your whole system says, fix this now. Call them, text them, explain, clarify, correct the record, tell everybody the full story, defend your intentions, prove you are not what they said, make people understand before the lie grows any bigger. That urge is powerful because it feels moral. It feels like standing up for truth. It feels like protecting your name. It feels like refusing to let darkness speak louder than reality. But here is the hard truth. The urge to defend yourself is often exactly what the smear is counting on, because once you enter panic, you become easier to frame. That is the second layer people must understand. A smear campaign does not always need to fully destroy you through the original lie. Sometimes, it only needs to provoke a reaction that can be used as fresh material. If you send the emotional paragraph, they can call you unstable. If you start contacting everyone, they can call you manipulative. If you sound hurt, they can say you are dramatic. If you sound firm, they can say you are aggressive. If you expose their inconsistency too early and too emotionally, they can act as though you are obsessed, bitter, or trying to control the narrative. Now the story is no longer only what they said. It is what they got you to do next. That is why desperate self-defense so often fails. Not because the truth is weak, because panic hands the lie more fuel. The person smearing you may understand this instinctively. They know that if they can create enough pressure around your name, you may start speaking from a wound instead of from wisdom. You may begin over-explaining. You may begin defending yourself to people who never earned access to your full story. You may start scattering your energy across multiple conversations, trying to patch every hole at once. You may become so focused on disproving the accusation that you stop noticing how your desperation is now being observed too, and that is when the smear gains momentum. Because frantic energy is easy to misread from the outside. Someone watching from a distance does not always see your pain accurately. They just see activity. They see tension. They see emotional heat. And if the gossip already prepared them to expect instability, your attempt to clear your name can accidentally look like confirmation. That is one of the cruelest parts of this kind of attack. The more urgently you try to prove who you are not, the more some people become suspicious. Not because your truth is false, because panic has a visual language, and smear campaigns know how to exploit it. Maybe you have lived this already. You tried to explain yourself to someone who had already been primed against you. You wrote the long message hoping clarity would win. You defended your heart to people who were only half listening. You thought honesty would clean everything up, but somehow afterward you felt more exposed, not more understood. Now there were more screenshots, more retellings, more secondhand versions of your pain moving around without your control. That is what desperate self-defense often creates. More material, more atmosphere, more entry points. And that is why wisdom has to step in early. Not every lie deserves an immediate speech. Not every rumor deserves your freshest energy. Not every listener deserves your full explanation. Not every accusation can be untangled by chasing it room to room. That does not mean you never clarify. It does not mean you allow lies to live uncontested forever. It does not mean you become passive while your name is mishandled. It means you stop responding as if speed itself is safety. Because in smear dynamics, speed often belongs to the liar. They want quick emotion, quick defense, quick exposure, quick scrambling, quick proof that they can still move your inner world fast enough to make you lose your pacing. That is why the truth often has to move differently, slower, cleaner, more consistent, less emotional in public, more anchored in what can be sustained. That may feel unfair at first, especially if your heart is burning to say exactly what happened. But the goal is not only to speak. The goal is to survive the distortion without becoming distorted by it yourself. That is the deeper challenge. Can you stay consistent while someone else performs urgency? Can you stay grounded while they keep pushing atmosphere? Can you resist the temptation to become your own PR team every time the lie flares up somewhere new? Can you tell the truth where necessary without turning your whole life into a courtroom? Those questions matter because gossip is not only trying to damage your reputation, it is trying to bait your nervous system. It wants you spinning. It wants you hyper-vigilant. It wants you monitoring every social shift. It wants you replaying conversations, wondering who heard what, trying to guess who believes whom, trying to manage perceptions in 10 directions at once. That mental state is exhausting. And exhausted people are easier to manipulate. They start talking too much, explaining too much, trusting the wrong listeners, oversharing with people who are only collecting, confessing their hurt to people who secretly prefer a messy story over a true one. That is why the urge to defend yourself has to be handled with great care. Because the instinct itself is not wrong. The timing and form are what matter. You do not defeat a smear by becoming louder than it. You defeat it by becoming more consistent than it. That is hard for people who are naturally sincere. Sincere people assume that if they just speak openly, truth will be recognized. But gossip does not operate by sincerity. It operates by repetition, emotional framing, and social contagion. So if you answer it only with panic, you are bringing the wrong weapon to the battle. You need endurance. You need discernment. You need restraint. You need to know when silence is strength and when a clean factual statement is enough. You need to know the difference between defending your name and feeding the spectacle built around your name. And that is not easy when your heart is hurting, especially because smear campaigns create another kind of temptation. The temptation to explain yourself to everybody so no one can misunderstand you. But that is a trap too. The more people you try to win all at once, the more scattered you become. The more scattered you become, the less weight your truth carries. It starts sounding reactive rather than rooted. That is why the early stage of smear protection is not about saying everything. It is about not saying too much too fast. It is about recognizing that isolation is often part of the tactic. The liar wants you to feel cut off enough that you start fighting for social survival from a wounded place. They want the urgency. They want the visible distress. They want the proof that you are as unstable as they implied. Do not give them that version of you. Let other people rush. Let gossip run hot for a moment if it must. Let weak listeners expose themselves. Let time begin separating the curious from the discerning, because what looks strongest at the beginning of a smear often weakens with repetition. Why? Because lies are heavy to carry. They require maintenance, they require memory, they require emotional management. They require the same performance over and over. And eventually, if you stay consistent, something starts showing. Cracks. Details slip. Tones change. Versions shift. People notice strange contradictions. The story starts needing too much help to stay alive. But none of that becomes visible if you are still spending all your energy trying to outrun the lie before it has time to unravel itself. That is the deeper lesson here. Your first job is not to panic. Your first job is to remain internally unhooked enough to let deception begin exhausting itself. Because what looks like social power in the beginning is often just borrowed momentum. And borrowed momentum cannot sustain itself forever. But the next part is where this becomes even more important. Because once you stop the urge to defend yourself from taking over, you begin seeing a different path entirely. You begin realizing that not every false story needs you to crush it. Some only need time, consistency, and enough space for contradictions to start ruining the teller's credibility on their own. And that is where the whole strategy changes. The whole strategy changes the moment you realize something important. You do not always have to defeat a false story by overpowering it. Sometimes you defeat it by outlasting it. That is where many people regain their footing. Because a smear campaign feels strongest in the beginning. It feels loud, coordinated, emotionally convincing, and socially dangerous. It seems like the lie has momentum, while the truth is standing there with no microphone, no dramatic presentation, no urgent allies rushing in. In those early moments, it can honestly feel as though deception has all the advantage. But that is only true in the short term, because lies have a weakness truth does not have. Lies have to be maintained. Truth only has to remain itself. A lie has to be remembered. A lie has to be repeated. A lie has to be adjusted based on who heard what. A lie has to stay emotionally persuasive while surviving changing contexts. A lie has to manage details. A lie has to account for contradictions. A lie has to perform consistency it does not naturally possess. That is exhausting over time. And this is why restraint becomes such a powerful strategy in smear dynamics. When you stop scrambling, stop feeding every flare-up, and stop trying to race the rumor in all directions at once, something starts happening that panic would never let you see. Contradictions begin surfacing. This is the part many wounded people miss because they are too busy bleeding in public to notice that the liar is slowly losing control of their own narrative. They are so focused on putting out fires that they do not realize the fire starter is having trouble keeping the smoke shaped the same way in every room. But that is often exactly what happens. One person hears one version. Another person hears a slightly sharper version. A third person hears a softer version designed to sound more innocent. The timeline shifts depending on the audience. The motive shifts depending on the audience. The level of injury shifts depending on the audience. The facts start bending according to what gets the best emotional response from the listener. That is not sustainable because even skilled liars have a limit. They may be emotionally compelling for a while, but over time, performances cracks. The same story told repeatedly starts wearing thin. Energy changes. Details drift. Emphasis changes. The version they told one person does not line up perfectly with what they implied to another. What was once presented as certainty becomes vagueness. What was once outrage becomes selective memory. What was once a firm accusation becomes a softer suggestion when they sense the first version will not hold up cleanly under time. That is how contradictions begin ruining the story, not always through one dramatic exposure, usually through accumulation. A listener hears something that does not quite match. Another person notices the timeline feels different than before. Someone who was there remembers a key detail differently. A person who stayed neutral long enough begins realizing the storyteller always sounds most convincing when facts are thinnest and emotion is highest. The room starts sensing effort where there once seemed to be authenticity. And effort matters because truth carries a different weight than fabrication. Truth does not need constant theatrical support. It does not need as much polishing. It does not need the same level of emotional management to stay credible. It can sit quietly and still remain itself. Deception cannot. Deception needs tending. It needs monitoring. It needs emotional editing. It needs the liar to keep returning to it and adjusting it so the audience stays pointed in the desired direction. That is why endurance is so important. A liar can sound powerful in one conversation. It is much harder to sound organically consistent across 20. And once you understand that, you stop trying to force exposure too early. You begin letting time become part of the process. You begin seeing that not every contradiction needs you to announce it the second you spot it. Some contradictions expose more cleanly when they are allowed to mature in plain sight. That takes discipline, because the temptation is to jump in the moment you hear the first inconsistency. To call it out, to confront it, to message the people involved, to say, "See, I told you." They change the story. And sometimes there is a place for calm clarification. But if you move too early from a wounded place, you can still end up feeding the same spectacle you were trying to escape. Remember, the goal is not just to be right. The goal is to remain credible. That means you do not have to chase every discrepancy like it is your last chance. Credibility often grows in the people who do not need to perform certainty with emotional desperation. They remain stable. They say little when little is wise. They keep their posture. They let patterns reveal themselves. They do not assist the lie by turning their whole life into a reaction to it. This is especially important because contradiction is often more visible to third parties than to the person being smeared. The person under attack feels the emotional cost most deeply, so they are often more tempted to fix it fast. But the outside observer is seeing something else too. They are watching tone. They are watching repetition. They are watching whether the storyteller seems strangely invested in keeping the narrative alive. They are watching whether the details stay stable. They are watching whether the person being accused remains wildly inconsistent or quietly steady over time. That contrast tells a story of its own, and that is why one of the strongest things you can do in the middle of a smear campaign is remain boringly consistent. Not flashy, not dramatic, not hyper-explanatory, consistent. You keep telling the truth the same way. You keep your facts clean. You do not keep revising your own account out of fear. You do not add embellishment just because the lie sounds dramatic. You do not start throwing extra accusations in hopes of balancing the scales. You do not become reactive in 10 directions. You remain steady. That steadiness starts doing something very powerful. It gives discerning people something stable to compare the chaos against. And once there is a stable point of reference, the frantic adjustments inside the lie become more visible. This is where the mini example matters. When a liar tells a story twice, the details always begin to shift. Maybe the first time they say the conversation happened on a Tuesday. Later, it becomes sometime that week. Maybe at first they say you screamed. Later, they say you got intense. Maybe at first they say everyone was uncomfortable. Later, they can only name one person. Maybe at first they claim they were blindsided. Later, it becomes clear there had been previous tension they left out. Maybe at first they present themselves as calm and innocent. Later, they admit they said certain things too. But now those details are framed as understandable reactions rather than part of the original conflict. Small changes, but revealing ones. Because lies rarely collapse all at once. They fray. The edges start loosening. The certainty becomes selective. The confidence gets replaced by over-explaining or emotional overacting. The story begins needing more support than it did before. That is why people who stay quiet long enough often watch something surprising happen. The liar starts exposing themselves not through one giant mistake, but through the labor of having to keep the false narrative alive. And that is where the silent accumulation of proof becomes so important. Because while contradictions are surfacing outwardly, something else needs to be happening inwardly and practically. You need to be gathering yourself, grounding yourself, and where appropriate, documenting reality with calm, not obsession. This is not about becoming paranoid. It is not about turning your life into an investigation board. It is not about stalking, spying, or collecting endless evidence for some grand future takedown. It is much simpler than that. It is about not being careless with truth. If messages exist, keep what is relevant. If dates matter, note them. If a clean factual record helps you stay sane, keep one. If the story touches work, community, or any setting where reality may later matter, preserve what is appropriate with dignity. If someone reaches out sincerely and asks what happened, respond with concise truth, not emotional flooding. That is silent proof, not loud performance. Quiet integrity. You do not always need proof to persuade everyone. Sometimes you need proof simply to keep your own mind from being gaslit by the atmosphere. That matters. Because smear campaigns do not only try to damage your social standing, they try to disrupt your inner certainty. They create enough noise that you start second-guessing what really happened, how clear it was, whether maybe you were too sensitive, whether maybe the truth really is blurrier than you remember. And when that starts happening, a factual anchor can be deeply stabilizing. Not because paper heals everything, because distortion thrives where memory is pressured by emotion. So you keep what is clean. You note what is necessary. You do not obsess. You do not announce. You do not weaponize. You simply refuse to let truth become sloppy inside you, just because the atmosphere outside has become polluted. That is wisdom. And once you start moving that way, another shift happens. You become less hungry to convince everybody. That is huge, because one of the first signs that healing is returning in a smear situation is that you no longer feel compelled to chase every uninformed person with your side of the story. You begin discerning audience. You begin recognizing who is actually worth clarifying with and who is simply attracted to the drama itself. That distinction protects so much energy. Some people want truth. Some people want a show. Do not confuse them. A person who truly cares may ask directly, listen carefully, and not require you to perform agony in order to believe that something was mishandled. A person who is feeding on gossip often wants detail, emotional intensity, and access to your pain in a way that feels strangely consuming. They are not trying to understand. They are trying to participate. You do not owe those people your interior world. This is why silent proof matters. It keeps you rooted enough that you are no longer trying to turn every bystander into a juror. You begin understanding that not everyone gets a full explanation. Some people will misunderstand for a while. Some weak listeners will stay confused. Some people who love quick stories more than slow truth may keep their distance. Let them. Time has a way of sorting listeners too. The ones addicted to spectacle usually move on to the next spectacle. The ones capable of discernment often begin noticing what does not add up. The ones who actually know character start comparing the story against the reality they have observed over time. And the ones who are only ever loosely attached may reveal through their reaction that they were never sturdy enough to hold you fairly anyway. That last part hurts, but it also clarifies. Because smear campaigns do not only expose liars, they expose audiences. They reveal who needed almost no evidence to believe the worst. They reveal who values access to drama over loyalty to truth. They reveal who can be emotionally steered with very little substance. They reveal who was never actually committed to understanding you as a whole person. That revelation can feel brutal in the moment, but it becomes useful later. It teaches you where not to overinvest. It teaches you who was attached to your presence but not anchored in your character. It teaches you which relationships were sturdy and which were merely socially convenient. And as this all unfolds, your role remains the same. Stay stable. Stay factual. Stay measured. Stay harder to provoke into public unraveling. Stay alert without becoming consumed. Stay consistent enough that time has something solid to work with. That phrase matters. Time can only expose a lie cleanly if truth remains recognizable while the lie is busy shifting. That is why your consistency is not passive. It is strategic. Every day you do not become a theatrical counter-performance. You are helping the contrast sharpen. Every time you resist over-explaining, you protect your credibility. Every time you answer with concise truth instead of emotional overflow, you refuse to become easy material. Every time you keep your life from collapsing into reaction, you remind yourself and others that your identity is not at the mercy of the rumor cycle. This is where patience becomes a form of power, not weak patience, not avoidance, not spiritual denial. Disciplined patience. The kind that understands immediate vindication is not the only kind of vindication. The kind that knows frantic self-defense often makes lies look larger than they are. The kind that trusts contradictions to do some of the exposing if given enough room. The kind that can bear temporary misunderstanding without turning that misunderstanding into a lifestyle of proving. That is a high level of self-command, and it is not easy. There may still be nights where you feel the ache, still moments where you want to send the message, make the call, say the whole thing, list every inconsistency, drag the story into daylight by force. But if you keep choosing steadiness, eventually something starts happening. The story gets tired, not truth, the false story. It gets harder to maintain, harder to retell with the same confidence, harder to stabilize across different listeners, harder to keep emotionally fresh without sounding obsessed, harder to keep alive when the person being smeared refuses to become the chaotic villain the narrative required. And that is the hinge point. Because once the lie starts tiring, you are no longer primarily in the stage of surviving the first impact. You are entering the stage where your own framework matters most. How you protect your peace. How you respond when clarification is needed. How you let truth outlast noise without becoming passive or paranoid. That is where the truth outlast system comes in. And once you understand that system, you stop trying to force vindication and start building for it. You stop trying to force vindication the moment you realize something deeper. Truth does not usually win by panic. It wins by endurance, by clarity, by consistency, by refusing to become so emotionally hijacked that you start helping the lie survive. That is what the truth outlast system is for. Not to make you passive. Not to teach you to say nothing in every situation. Not to ask you to enjoy being misunderstood, It is for the painful stretch where gossip is moving, your name is being mishandled, and you need a way to protect your spirit without turning your whole life into a frantic defense campaign. Because that is the risk. When people start talking, you can become so focused on fixing perception that you stop guarding your own peace. You start managing rooms you are not in. You start editing yourself for audiences you cannot control. You start burning emotional energy on people who were never committed to fairness in the first place. The truth outlast system pulls you out of that. The first part is this: stabilize before you strategize. Before you answer, clarify, confront, or correct anything, you have to get your inner world out of immediate panic. A smear campaign creates emotional acceleration. It makes you feel as though you must respond this minute or lose everything. That is rarely true. What is true is that if you respond while dysregulated, you are more likely to create fresh material for the rumor cycle. So first, steady yourself. Breathe before you text. Pray before you explain. Sit down before you decide who deserves a response. Tell the truth somewhere safe before you speak it publicly. Let your body come down from the social threat long enough to hear your own wisdom again. This matters because panic distorts proportion. It makes every listener feel crucial. Every rumor feel global. Every silence feel like confirmation. Every shift in someone's face feel catastrophic. But once you calm your system, you start seeing more clearly. Some people do not matter as much as your fear told you they did. Some situations do not require a statement. Some people already know enough about your character to wait for the noise to pass. Some distances are not proof you have lost your whole life. They are proof that weak structures are being tested. Do not build your whole response plan from the first wave of shock. Stabilize first. Then comes the second part. Discern the room. This is one of the biggest mistakes people make when gossip spreads. They treat every audience the same. They think everyone who hears the lie deserves the same explanation. They start speaking broadly when wisdom would have spoken specifically. But not every room requires your voice. Not every person deserves context. Not every listener is actually listening in good faith. So ask, who are the people that truly matter here? Who has direct relational weight in your life? Who has legitimate reason to need clarity? Who has shown maturity before? Who is truly confused and open versus merely curious and consuming? Who holds influence in a real way, and who is just noise in the atmosphere? That discernment protects your energy. Because if you try to clear your name with everyone, you end up exhausted and diluted. But if you speak clearly, calmly, and selectively where it truly matters, your truth keeps weight. Maybe there are one or two relationships that deserve a direct conversation. Maybe there is a leader, a family member, a trusted friend, a colleague, a specific circle where factual clarity matters. Maybe the right response is one clean statement to the right people and nothing more. That is enough more often than wounded minds believe. You do not need a campaign. You need discernment. And this leads to the third part of the system. Say less, but say it clean. When truth does need to be spoken, keep it simple. Keep it factual. Keep it congruent. Do not try to match the drama of the lie. Do not make your clarity depend on emotional intensity. Do not flood the listener with every wound, every side detail, every remembered offense, every private feeling. That often makes your truth harder to hold. Say what happened. Say what is false. Say what you are and are not participating in. Say what boundary now exists. Then stop. Something as simple as, that version of events is not accurate and I am not going to keep engaging. Distorted retellings can carry more weight than 10 paragraphs written from pain. Or, there has been a lot said indirectly. I will only speak to this once. That account is incomplete and misleading, and I am choosing not to fuel further gossip. Or, I understand there has been confusion. I am available for one direct, respectful conversation if clarity is truly needed, but I will not participate in rumor exchanges. That tone matters. Not performative, not defensive, not begging, not theatrical, clean. Because truth has a sound when it is not trying to entertain or emotionally overpower. It sounds settled. Even if the person is still hurting, the truth itself sounds governed. This is how you protect your credibility. Not by saying the most, by saying the truest. Then comes the fourth part. Document. Do not dramatize. This is where silent accumulation of proof becomes practical. If there are messages, save what is relevant. If dates matter, keep them straight. If there are specific events being distorted, note them accurately. If certain false claims could affect work, community trust, or important relationships, keep what supports reality, but do not turn documentation into obsession. You are not building a shrine to the attack. You are maintaining a record of truth. That difference is critical. Dramatizing keeps you emotionally fused to the smear. It makes the rumor your whole atmosphere. Documentation done calmly keeps you anchored without requiring constant re-entry into the chaos. It is a form of order, a way of saying, I will not let distortion make me sloppy too. This is particularly important when a liar begins shifting their story over time. You do not need to chase every shift publicly, but you do need to know what is real, so that when a direct question comes from the right place, you are not answering from emotional fog. You are answering from stability. And remember, proof is not always gathered for exposure. Sometimes it is gathered for peace, for your own mind, for the day you are tempted to doubt what happened, for the moments when the atmosphere gets so strange that you begin wondering whether your memory is exaggerating things, for the practical situations where a clean record matters. That is strength. Then comes the fifth part of the truth outlast system. Let character do the long work. This is the part impatient pain hates most, but it is often where the deepest vindication begins. Once you have stabilized, discerned the room, spoken cleanly where necessary, and kept what is factual, your next task is not to keep proving yourself every week. Your next task is to live in a way that gives truth time to gather weight. Show up the same. Keep your word. Treat people cleanly. Stay congruent. Do not start lying because someone lied about you. Do not start gossiping because someone gossiped about you. Do not start recruiting alliances through emotional manipulation because someone tried to isolate you through narrative management. Keep your hands clean. That matters more than people realize. Because in smear situations, people are not only evaluating information. Over time, they are evaluating energy. They are watching who stays strangely obsessed, who keeps the story alive, who needs constant audience reinforcement, who remains reactive, who keeps escalating, who seems at peace, who remains consistent, who continues living with quiet integrity. Character accumulates, so does distortion, and over time the two become easier to distinguish. A liar often depends on repetition. A truthful person can often depend on reality. Reality has texture. It shows up in patterns. It reveals itself in how you treat people who can do nothing for you. It reveals itself in whether your life keeps producing the same chaos they described, or whether the story begins looking less and less believable the longer people actually observe you. This is why it is so important not to become unrecognizable in the middle of the attack. If the smear says you are volatile, and you become visibly volatile everywhere, you help the lie. If the smear says you are manipulative and you start emotionally working every room, you help the lie. If the smear says you are deceptive and now you start speaking in vague, evasive ways because you are hurt, you help the lie. Do not let the attack teach you to imitate the atmosphere. Remain who truth says you are. That takes strength. It also takes patience, because vindication often feels slow when you are the one hurting. But slow does not mean absent. Slow often means deep. It means the truth is being absorbed into places that spectacle never could have reached. It means people are quietly noticing, quietly comparing, quietly realizing that the story required more emotional support than reality does. That realization is powerful. Then comes the sixth part of the system. Keep building while the noise burns out. This is where many people either collapse or rise. A smear campaign wants your life to become organized around itself. It wants your days consumed by rumor management. It wants your calling interrupted, your routines broken, your creativity drained, your joy suspended, your future postponed until everyone finally understands. Do not surrender that much territory. Keep building. Keep tending what is in front of you. Keep showing up where your real life is happening. Keep investing in the relationships that are actually sturdy. Keep working, keep healing, keep praying, keep resting, keep becoming more rooted than the rumor. This is not denial. It is refusal. Refusal to let gossip become your identity. Refusal to let somebody else's performance become the center of your season. Refusal to give the smear the biggest room in your inner house. The more you keep building, the more something important happens. You stop measuring your life only by what was said about you. You start measuring it by what remains true in you. Your focus returns. Your calling starts breathing again. Your mind becomes available for more than survival. And that is when you realize something beautiful. Truth does not only outlast lies by exposing them. It also outlasts lies by refusing to die under them. That is a deep kind of victory. And once you live inside that, you begin entering the final movement. Your victorious reemergence. This is not about dramatic comeback energy. It is not about posting harder, shining louder, proving yourself with polished performance, or making sure everyone sees how unaffected you are. That is not emergence. That is still reaction. Victorious reemergence is quieter than that. It is the moment you realize you are no longer primarily living under the fog of what was said. The atmosphere begins changing, not always all at once, but enough for you to feel it. People who are discerning start seeing the contradictions. The weak story begins losing freshness. The liar begins sounding repetitive. The room starts tiring of the performance. The people who rush to believe without evidence reveal themselves for what they are. And the people who were wise enough to wait begin leaning back toward what is real. But even more importantly, you begin returning to yourself. That is the deeper victory. You are no longer checking every face, no longer decoding every room, no longer replaying every rumor, no longer planning speeches in your head while trying to live your day, no longer making your worth answer to the loudest lie in circulation. That is reemergence, not just public, internal. And when that begins, your name starts carrying a different kind of weight. Not because everyone suddenly apologizes, not because every false listener returns with tears and accountability. That is not usually how life works. Some people will stay shallow. Some will never admit they were too easily led. Some will keep distance because their pride cannot survive the realization that they judge too fast. Let them. Your victorious reemergence does not depend on universal correction. It depends on congruence. It depends on your life becoming stable enough, clean enough, and steady enough that the truth has room to be seen without your constant help. It depends on the people who truly matter, encountering enough of your real character over time that the false story becomes harder and harder to reconcile with reality. That is what lies cannot survive forever. Reality. Reality outlives performance. Reality outlives emotional theater. Reality outlives selective storytelling. Reality outlives the liar's memory. And maybe the most painful but useful revelation in all of this is that not everybody is meant to rejoin you after the smoke clears. Some people exposed themselves to how quickly they believed, how eagerly they consumed, how lazily they judged, how little direct conversation they required before distancing themselves. That hurts, but it also clarifies your circle. A smear campaign can wound you. It can also reveal your environment. It shows you who loves drama more than truth, who needs almost no evidence to withdraw loyalty, who can be emotionally steered, who has no internal process for waiting, verifying, or discerning, and who actually has the maturity to watch quietly before joining a crowd. That revelation protects your future, because once the season passes, you do not have to rebuild every bridge. Some bridges were made of rumor and convenience. Let those fall. What remains after truth outlasts the noise is often more real than what existed before the attack began. That is another kind of victory. A cleaner circle, a steadier center, a more discerning spirit, a reputation not built on never being talked about, but on surviving distortion without becoming distorted yourself. That matters, because anyone can look peaceful in a room where nothing is being said. It takes a different kind of strength to remain internally ordered while your name is being mishandled. And if you are in that season now, hear this clearly. You do not have to chase every whisper. You do not have to answer every curious person. You do not have to become your own emergency press conference. You do not have to let panic turn you into something unrecognizable. You do not have to make gossip the center of your spiritual life. What you need is steadiness, discernment, a clean mouth, accurate memory, wise silence, and enough patience to let contradictions start doing their work. That is the truth outlast system. Stabilize before you strategize. Discern the room. Say less, but say it clean. Document. Do not dramatize. Let character do the long work. Keep building while the noise burns out. That is how you protect your name without losing yourself. That is how you survive social distortion without making distortion your whole identity. That is how the lie starts tightening around its own credibility while you remain clear. And when the reemergence comes, receive it without arrogance. Do not become obsessed with being proven right. Do not become addicted to the downfall of the person who lied. Do not build your peace on watching them unravel. Build your peace on the fact that you stayed aligned while deception exhausted itself. That is higher ground. If this message is putting language to something you have been carrying, let that be known. Keep your hands clean. Keep your facts straight. Keep your spirit from becoming a courtroom. Keep letting time separate the impulsive from the discerning. Keep letting your life speak in places your panic never could. And remember this, not every person who hears a lie becomes your responsibility. Not every misunderstanding is yours to fix. Not every room deserves your defense. Not every story survives time. But truth, when lived consistently, has a way of returning with more weight than rumor ever had. If this spoke to your spirit, leave your testimony in the comments and pass this message to someone who needs to know that truth can outlast the noise.